Okay, it seems I had to do
Yes.
that. I've now enabled recording. So
Okay, okay.
Thank you, Devdatta. Shall I start?
Yes, yes.
First of all, let me say that I'm absolutely delighted to speak to the community at the CSSS. While I was doing my horror research during my PhD, I used to hang out at CSSS a little bit and got to know some faculty there and continue to have some friends who are associated with the CSSS. Thank you, Prachi, for making the connection with CSSS this time around. My work today that I'm presenting, I'll say a little bit about that in a bit. This is from my second project, which is located in Vrindavan in northern India. And thank you, Devdatta, for doing all the series of emails that we had to go through to finalize this and taking care of the technical stuff on your end. I'll get started. So this project began in 2019, February of 2019, when I first went to Vrindavan. I went as a devotee and as an anthropologist simultaneously, and that created some complications. And I'm beginning to unpack them as the research is going on. It's been about, since March 2020, I haven't been able to go to Vrindavan at all because of the pandemic. And a couple of papers are in the pipeline. This particular paper is becoming an article that's going into an edited volume titled Liberalism and Its Encounters in India. It's under contract with Routledge. And so I'm looking forward to the feedback from this community to make the paper better before I send it out for publication. This paper is specifically, it's an outtake from that research. So I'll say more about it in a bit. Let me get started. My paper today is titled Leaving the Secular Home, Anthropology and the Journey of Faith. What does anthropology of secularism look like? To talk about secularism, most anthropologists go to its conceptual opposite, to the realms of faith. I'm doing so as well. I have embarked on an ethnographic project in Vrindavan about the competing sovereignties between Krishna and the nation state in 2019. I was also at this time starting to practice in some liminal ways the Vaishnava faith. This research project looks into the practice of bhakti, and I won't say too much about bhakti to an Indian audience. To a Western audience, one has to explain. The practice of bhakti and the accompanying politics that surround it in the sacred geography of Vrindavan. But this particular article that I'm presenting to you today is kind of an outtake from that larger research. In this article, I provide a bit of an autoethnography, trying to show the various contradictions and aporias surrounding the journey of a secular person who's moving towards the realm of faith. In unpacking such complication, slide 2, I wish to mark out the central problem of a liberal person trying to desert selectively one's secular emotional home. This article finally offers some reflections on the nature of secular liberal personhood. It does not provide a trenchant critique of secularism of the kind that we get from Ashish Nandi or even Talal Asad, although I agree with most of those critiques. What it does is it unpacks how the liberal secular person actually functions through an architecture of emotions of desire and disgust. I ran into various dilemmas in my immersion into the field of religion, that being the site of Vrindavan and the discourses on bhakti that I read, while I retained my tether in the home of secular rationality. Religion is for religious people, there said a voice in my head as I roamed around Vrindavan. Religious people are often duped and manipulated by the machinations of faith, I often thought while conducting fieldwork in Vrindavan. In its actual literal doing, participant observation, the anthropological method, hits upon a conundrum, whether to immerse in the doing or the watching or the simultaneous combination of both. If the two have to diverge, I suspect they would deliver very different ethnographies. I deliver here an account and some analyses of my own journey on a tightrope from secularism's peculiar, suspicious, skeptical rationality towards the immersion into the public of bhakti. I offer here some thoughts informed by my travels in the Vrindavan region as a selective believer and as an ethnographer, all the while tethered to the secular home. In the evening, Radha Kanto, who used to drive an e-rickshaw and he took me around Vrindavan, suggested I watch the Arati or evening offering to Yamunaji, the Yamuna River, at sunset. We arrived at a point where the e-rickshaw could not go any further. I walked the rest of the way on stone-paved ghats along the murky river to reach the ghat where the preparation for Arati had already begun. I sat precariously on the steps, huddling against my cloth bag because I had been warned my belongings may be attacked by monkeys. I was asked by one of the men to go and join the line of women who were sitting at the edge of the ghat, ready to offer flowers to the river. I said I didn't want to go right down to the edge of the ghat because it was too cold there. The real reason was that I was afraid to look down at the river from the precarious high perch of the ghat. I was experiencing a kind of vertigo. The women, though, sitting at the edge of the ghat in their saris and exposed bellies, did not seem bothered by the cold. It was February. They were taking instructions from the patriarch priest sitting at their center. The priest had his hair tied in a bun on top of his head. He wore a down jacket and a white dhoti. He looked severe. The mantra chanting and the flower offering went on simultaneously. They lined up behind the priest afterwards, and I joined the queue. And we threw pieces of kneaded flour, atta, into the waters. Then the grand brass lamp was lit. It had many levels. Each level contained a number of diyas or small lamps. Slide, please. The senior women were given smaller lamp holders, which were still elaborate ones. And other women, me and a Caucasian woman included, were given metal plates with one lamp each. The priest slowly started dancing with the massive lamp. Another man who looked like an important person stepped forth and took the lamp holder from him. He held the obviously heavy and hot object with an orange cloth and continued the dance. It was a show of masculine power and resilience. These men were entitled to lift this massive brass lamp holder in offering homage to Sri Yamunaji, or the Yamuna River. Stuck to the walls of the cart, there was a massive poster that declared solidarity towards Indian CRPF soldiers who died in the terrorist attack in Pulwama the day before. It was Valentine's Day in the rest of the country. This scene was filled with material provocation for the senses: fire, camphor, flowers, water. This assembly was offering respect to a much ecologically damaged river. This sensory provocation was simultaneously declaring sovereignty over a religious community and a nation state. Sensory provocation seemed to be at the core of the faith. A huge poster was stuck by the side of the cart, declaring allegiance to the Hindu fight for nationhood. This was the evening of the recent Pulwama attack on Indian soldiers by the Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorist outfit on February 14, 2019. Sovereignty was displayed here in the name of Sri Krishna, otherwise known as Kanhaiya, Govardhanji, Giridharji, Banke Bihariji. This was Vrindavan, the sacred territory of Lord Krishna. This is where he is believed to have been raised simply among a community of cowherds, the Yadavas. He is worshipped by various sects here in a parental capacity. The devotees often take the mantle of being his parents, Yashoda or Nanda, or parental figures of the Yadava neighborhood, raising a mischievous, butter-stealing Kanhaiya. They chanted, slide please. Hathi Ghoda Pal ki, Jai Kanhaiya Lal ki. Elephants, horses, and sedans, glory to the child Krishna. This territory belonged to Krishna and his devotees. I entered this space in fear and anticipation. Jonathan Edelman draws out the steps towards achieving bhakti through twofold route of energetic necessity, and sadhu sangha being the second step, which means fellowship or association of saints and devotees. And the catalytic event of a jolt of presence excavating Krishna from the interiority of an unsuspecting person such as me, I believe the collective effervescence of Vrindavan was inserting in me a spontaneous bhakti. But to find consolidation of such bhakti in crowd fellowship, I ran into difficulty. The dancing, chanting, convulsing crowd was threatening my secular sensibilities. My secular persona was intervening in this search. Krishna is indeed the carrier and declarer of sovereign authority to this day in the sacred territory of Braj. In Krishna's name, this land was bestowed with an imagination of an innocent, mischievous child amidst the cowherd community. And Leela, slide please, between the adult Krishna and his beloved Radha, slide please, surrounded by gopis. Leela is a kind of jouissance, Krishna's play, David Haberman calls this purposeless play, where he purposefully makes himself into the image of an innocent child or a young cowherd to play with the subject population. His mother Yashoda and his primary lover Radha assert power over him. Thus, they too are interpolated in the Vaishnava pantheon in these temples strewn around all over the Braj region. This animation of play and acting in various capacities to the baby or young Krishna, where the devotees themselves imagine himself to be a parent or a lover, form the core of worship here. A priest at the Banke Bihari temple tells me, we don't follow very rigid procedures of puja or worship. We simply enact bhava, essence or mood. We take care of the deity as we would a little child. We pull the curtains over the deity from the time to time as we would a little child. We wouldn't want everyone to stare at our child. It would bring him nazar, he said. The worship thrives in anthropomorphization of divinity to a point of extreme detail. The devotee exercises several roles of extreme gentleness and care as a parent, villager, neighbor, cousin, lover to Krishna. And yet the same devotee protects the right of Krishna to rule over this territory in a warlike affect. This warlike defensive affect weds with the outfit of the political right that wears the garb of Hindutva, as we very well know. In the cosmology of bhakti, the deity comes to occupy prana or life at the point at which the devotee locks eyes with the Godhead. Religious entities like devotees indeed have a social function explained in the structuralist tradition by the likes of Emil Durkheim. I wish to move away from it and ask about what presence does to the devotee once it is constructed in this complicated orchestration of bhava or essence. The priests of Banke Bihari construct a daily relationship of parent-child or familial theatricality around the deity. This ritual practice interpolates the deity into a fold of intimate lives for the devotee. It conjures presence by performance. Krishna is at once God as he is lover, son, mischievous cowherd, and a character whose demand for care and love among his devotees makes his enormous non-human presence palatable in human society. The land of Braj is often referred to as the body of Krishna. Devotees circumambulate and measure this land by moving while lying down on the earth. This is often called worship by Dandamati. It is yet another register by which presence is conjured in the physical milieu of these mundane small towns that have come to be called Braj. Geography translates into a simple materiality. Storytelling brings alive presence of the Godhead amidst the mundane landscape of Braj. It makes possible the enchantment of the entire region with the presence of the Godhead, not confined only to the physical materiality of the deity in the temple. A priest in Gokul points to the garden surrounding a temple. Slide, please. This is where Krishna danced in the form of a peacock on the request of his followers. I am amused. Of course, I didn't believe that Krishna danced here as a peacock, dressed as a peacock. I believe Krishna is here, was here, and will be here. I detected his presence everywhere. Why then did the stories told by the priests and other religious leaders evoke in me an amused suspicion? My secular tether intervened to introduce suspicion and some amusement at the narratives such as Krishna's dancing in Gokul as a peacock. I traveled to Gokul in an auto rickshaw from Vrindavan. The auto driver took me to a place not quite the Gokul I had been to earlier. I was told this is old Gokul. I walked through a maze of old cobbled alleys with little shrines on both sides, brightly colored, multi-paneled, ancient-looking doors and windows. My impulse was to take photographs of these doors and windows. I was hesitant because I had been told monkeys could snatch your phone. I ended up at the entrance of a temple called Panchayat Mandir Sri Nanda Bhavan. There were florists waiting outside, and I bought 10 rupees worth of flowers. I went in with a big group of devotees. They were being instructed about the conduct inside the inner quarters as I reached. The instructor had instructed everyone to enter crawling, literally on all fours. We crawled in, uncomfortably shuffling into a spot where the deity would be in our line of vision. We sat in a lone, low stone quarter facing the deity. A man spoke in Hindi in the mic. His words were not very legible to me because there was a huge crowd, except for the intermittent chant, Papa Paiya, Chale Kanhaiya, Hathi Ghoda Pal Ki, Jai Kanhaiya Lal Ki. Intermittently, people were asked to throw their hands in the air and laugh because they had no worries in the house of God. Then they declared that people could contribute towards Gaudan, gift of cow, a sum of rupees 1155. The priest kept saying there is no pressure. Give the gift only if it pleases you. If it causes you any financial or other difficulty, don't give. Despite that, there was subtle pressure on everyone. After they put up their hands to offer a gift, the instructor came over to them and asked them their names, their fathers, their villages, their mothers, their wives' older sons' names, and called these names out loudly. They were then given agya or permission to visit the 4 pilgrimage sites, the Char Dham. The assumption, of course, was that every adult is married and has children. I sat in discomfort. I had come to immerse myself in the world of religion. But now religion was exposing itself in an economic logic which evaded my idea of a pristine institution which would give me a break from modernity. Most of the group around me were from Bhilwara in Rajasthan. They were given saffron bands to wear around their necks as recognition for having given the gift of Gaudan. As the curtains before the deity were pulled, people were given prasad and were given the chance to pull the handle of the cradle in which baby Krishna was laid. They got up and moved away after this. The devotees sitting behind them moved up in order, but in the sitting condition. One must not be seen standing in the viewing line of the deity. I moved away feeling a little annoyed at this bid to pay money from people who were obviously from humble economic backgrounds. Why did the avenue of worship have to demand a high economic price, whatever the ritual might be? Why wasn't this a place of pure worship and invocation of the Godhead? Why was the Gaudan subtly forced on the Bhilwara villages? These were questions running in my head. An auto took me to Naya Gokul. The auto stopped where a whole maze of cobbled streets heavily laden with cow dung began. Here I stumbled upon another temple, which turned out to be a temple of Nanda and Yashoda Krishna's foster parents. The story goes that from jail in Mathura, where he was born, he was brought here in Gokul. The family in front of me was being subjected to the same drill as I saw in the other temple. of giving a considerable amount towards Gaudan. When my turn came, he asked me to contribute, the priest asked me to contribute 1,300 rupees. I was irritated and I said I didn't have cash. He said he would readily accept cards. I was trapped. I had to pay. I agreed. He said he asked me to consider a Gaudan which would be towards welfare of all my ancestors. I resisted at this point. He asked me to pull the handle of the cradle. I was offered prasad and two bright pink cloth bands, and as I walked out to pay him with my card, he got up to show me a stone of engravings of feet. He asked me to put my head to the feet engravings for blessings. I did so, and he put sandalwood marks on my forehead. As I got up, he asked me what I did for a living and wished that on my next visit, I would come with a son, a little Kanhaya. This close interpolation of a priest by the priest as a heterosexual woman whose only plea to God at this age could be for progeny irritated me further. In fact, that day I came back to the hotel feeling most irritated with the same religious establishment which had earlier provided me extreme feelings of love and devotion. How was I to reconcile this contradiction? Secularism, in its anchoring of my personhood, provide an explanation. Secularism remained an emotional home that I constantly looked back on in my journey towards Krishna. I say this without any value judgment. I'm not saying secularism is a good or bad thing at this point. In this strange tightrope of accepting religion as a way to detect divine presence in my everyday life, religion gave me a set of tools. It also gave me took me towards a set of people whose internal logics I'm yet to decipher. Slide, please. It also, why poor people from Bhilwara would readily submit to priestly pressure and give large sums of money for Gaudan was incomprehensible to me. This aporia also irritated me to no end. They could have politely resisted and still remained attached to the Godhead like I was trying to do, thought I. But no, they did not find it in themselves to dispute the priest's suggestion. They did not, unlike me, look with lenses of superiority and suspicion upon the inner workings of religion and especially its economic logics. I was looking to immerse myself in contemplation of the Godhead without the messy hierarchical realities of organized religion. This bifurcation would allow me to be religious without cutting out on my secular liberal sensibilities to a certain extent. Secularism, I learned, was not an easy home to leave behind. Secularism is not an easy prejudice to unlearn. Secularism constructs us as subjects of superior intelligence who are presumably capable of sniffing out the corrupt practices within religion and retain our moral project of equalitarian ethics, so to speak. Let me take a step back at this point and try to unpack the underpinnings of my journey as a secular liberal anthropologist, trying to introduce religious faith in my life and conduct fieldwork in the sacred geography of Vrindavan. The first step to showing the difficulties of such a journey is inbuilt in secularism itself and my predictable practice of it. The Indian secular project has derived, as Rajiv Bhargava and others have pointed out, from an equidistant state which stands at equal distance from religions, and not unlike the European model, the clean break between church and state. Ashish Nandi has eloquently pointed out the flaws of Indian secularism and showed within it the originary germs of the rise of the Hindu right. Moving away from these conversations on the nature of secularism of the Indian state and polity, I want to ponder on the internalized secularism of the liberal person. Liberal personhood emerges on the strong pillars of individual choice and public-private divide. Liberal persons, not unlike me, know the rules of critical rational debate to argue with other citizens and with the state about our point of view and our entitlements. Liberal persons are also emotionally attached to this ethos of liberalism and say secularism. What is this ethos? Charles Taylor, in his seminal work, A Secular Age, tries to get to the bottom of this. Taylor shows the existence of three arcs of secularity in modern society. Secularity is brought about through the evacuation of the public sphere of all religiosity and religious science, and the suspension of religious logics for rational ones. But it's the third arc that is the most provocative. Taylor writes, as you can see in the slide, belief in God is no longer axiomatic. There are alternatives. Then this will also likely mean that at least in certain milieu, it will be hard to sustain one's faith. There will be people who will feel bound to give it up, even though they others to whom faith is eligible possibility. There are certainly millions today of whom this is true. As an elaboration of this third arc of secularity on which my argument is pinned, Taylor shows in that in the modern age, religion becomes a choice, a matter of choice for many, not for everyone, but for many. In a time before modern secularism, there wasn't a clear option available to bring God within the purview of one's life or reject such an option. I learned a fair bit about my own religiosity in reading Taylor's unpacking of this third arc of secularity. I was indeed finding a certain stodgy secularism in fighting a certain stodgy secularism in affirming my faith in Vrindavan. But my personhood was entirely tethered to the notion of choice. I did not practice the absolute surrender to forces of God, especially in the surrender of skepticism that my research subjects from Bhilwara and other places were practicing. They are asked to give money gifts at temples by the priests, and they never think, unlike me, to question the good faith of that request. I was immersed in the secular act of choosing faith and seeking a private conversation with the Godhead in Vrindavan. I was simultaneously being skeptical of large numbers of people who keep religious institutions Bihari temple every morning and evening was difficult. It was as if I had come to pick the Godhead faith. I write elsewhere about the difficulty of doing ethnography while trying to practice the same faith that becomes the object of the ethnographic gaze. I write about the impossible simultaneity of consuming a truth and watching others consume it in their own way. The doing and the watching deliver divergent ethnographies, I argue, elsewhere. But for the purposes of this article, this ethnographic site is no longer the singing and dancing masses of Vrindavan, or the priest who asks for the gift of Gaudan, or the priest who points out to the place where Krishna danced as a peacock. The ethnographic site here is my liberal secular personhood. I realize well into my ongoing research stint in Vrindavan. This was a project about religion, but it was yielding very quickly conclusions about the secular persona that then took me to Charles Taylor. Taylor mentions that the current secular arrangement of power carries in it sediments of a different time, that modernity is accounted by a subtraction logic. Slide, please. Slide, please. Yeah. This disenchantment means minus something called enchantment. He writes, in other words, our sense of where we are is crucially defined in part by a story of how we got there. In that sense, there is an inescapable, though often negative, God reference in our very nature of secular age. And just because we describe where we are in relating to the journey, we can misdescribe it grievously by misidentifying the itinerary. This is what the subtraction accounts of modernity have in fact done. To get straight where we are, we have to go back and tell the story properly. Our past is sedimented in our present, and we are doomed to misidentify ourselves as long as we can't do justice where we come from. Religion is very much alive and well, as we know from the Indian case. Has secularism failed? Maybe not. But the three arcs of secularism that Taylor proposed were not meant to work in comparable pace and strength. The third arc, a matter of choice in religiosity, to decide whether or not one will wear the hijab, whether or not one wants to convert to a certain religion after what is not of one's birth, whether or not one will give money towards Gaudan, is the one that seems to be at play. Large numbers of people are choosing religion. Although Taylor doesn't offer a large explanation of this positive choice, choosing religion, he's mostly talking about the negative choice. Perhaps Sabah Mahmood's description of the women in the Islamic revivalist movement in Cairo were also choosing a certain religiosity in a perfectly secular move, at least in Taylor's conception. These debates form the backdrop of my argument. What is the nature of a secular polity, a secular society, etc. Indeed, they are not the necessary props for my argument, as they don't consider what a secularism does as an ethos to an individual person. What kind of personhood does it yield? Taylor writes in A Secular Age about a certain fullness, side please, fullness of life that the umbrella of religion, namely Latin Christendom, used to yield in a pre-modern time between 1500 to 2000, a time span of 500 years. A massive change occurred, at least in Western societies, where people started to consider the possibility that this fullness might be achieved without the intervention of anything beyond the human. Taylor writes, we have moved from a world in which a place of fullness was understood as an unproblematically outside or beyond human life to a conflicted age in which this construal is challenged by others, which place it in a wide range of different ways within human life. And further, I would like to claim that the coming of modern secularity, in my sense, has been coterminous with the rise of a society in which, for the first time in history, a purely self-sufficient humanism came to be a widely available option. I mean by this humanism, accepting no final goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiance to anything else beyond this flourishing. Of no previous society has this been true. Taking my own liberal secular personhood as a point of analysis, I noticed as I entered the temple towns in and around Vrindavan an immediate injection of a certain feeling of caution. God was great, I thought, but the people who are out here might be out to dupe me in his name. I was cautious. It is this suspicion that I want to relate to Taylor's argument of fullness. I was walking into Vrindavan without the emotion of needing God for any purpose in my life. Or rather, I was choosing God. It was a matter of autonomous choice. This is what set apart my optional religiosity to that of the Bhilwara villagers who contributed readily towards Gaudan on the priest's request. Slide, please. This suspicion may be considered natural given the common occurrence of petty corruption and cheating in Indian religious sites. Here, let me transition to Webkin's response to Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. Webkin considers secularism a moral narrative of modernity. He writes, it is not merely that the world has somehow become secular, rather secularity often presents itself in compulsory terms, even as an ethical demand. People in a wide range of societies find that they ought to be secular. The compulsory nature of this demand can go beyond the expectations of citizenship and legality into more emotional and subjective dimensions of personhood. In Keynes' terms, I had internalized the ethical imperative of secularism. I was keen to lose my tether to my secular emotional home, but I was simultaneously also anxious not to lose my modernity. This anxiety was enacted in ways that transcended my emotions of skepticism about the money making that took place at temples. I noticed that people were acting under the dominant assumption that their route to the Godhead must necessarily be through a priest or a guru, a human person who filled the space of a legitimate spokesperson for the Godhead. Most devotees found ways to negotiate this power that the priest or the guru had them over themselves and their families. Submission to the Godhead meant simultaneous submission to the authority of these religious leaders. Modernity had fed a story of self-mastery so much so that I was immediately critical of the power of such religious leaders, especially for the direct and unapologetic way in which they demanded submission of their followers. The witnessing of human submission to the authority of other humans triggered in me, I should admit, a degree of disgust. I, who is one of the mass of insignificant citizens of a post-colonial country who thinks nothing of routinely submitting to the authority of the state and to the machinations of many multinational companies, the secular personhood, therefore, is predicated upon hooking personhood to a horizon of desire that places faith in the power of the supposedly neutral state and fills it with coercive power, but is quick to be disgusted by any other form of subjection. In step with Webb Keen, I begin to dig into the deep interstices of the emotional architecture where faith was actually in the moral belief that this was a better time than any other, that I was a self-governed individual person, that I was free to choose a dollop of faith in my life while retaining its otherwise neat arrangement of power, where I unquestioningly obey the diktats of a secular, modern, capitalist world of desire and disgust, whose membership I value more than anything else. Keen also disagrees later in this essay with Taylor's blunt periodization between the pre-modern and the modern, and shows that there have been dissenters and heretics always, even in the pre-modern time. Not everyone was willingly religious. While this may be true through empirical research yielded by history and anthropology, it doesn't completely invalidate, I believe, Taylor's demonstration of a definite break in attitudes towards one's maker between 1500 and 2000. While heretics are well placed in that long history of faith and the slow triumph of reason over blind faith, it cannot be denied that the growth of a generalized attitude that God is a matter of choice is definitely a recent one, be it the West or the non-West. Through my own journey towards the Bhakti faith, I learned that optional belief is a feature of liberal secular persona and cannot be easily unlearned. It is common for historians and anthropologists to insist that there is continuity and rupture across the boundary between two historical periods. While I recognize the merit of such arguments against possibility of sweeping claims, I believe Taylor is pointing towards a large-scale change in attitudes towards the presence of God in one's immediacy and the need for the transcendent in achieving fullness in one's life. In conclusion, let me say that Taylor provoked me to think about the secular underpinnings of my selective embrace of faith, where the Godhead was embraced, but the ways and means of large numbers of fellow believers were not only rejected, but brought about a sense of revulsion. So secular modernity is, of course, guarded in the secular institutional arrangement of power that dominates and erases other forms of living with the transcendent and rendering the transcendent legible in the social world. But it is also a morality and an emotional architecture, a structure of feeling, if you will, through which the moderns live. It is also a personal ethos, possibly a deep-seated and dangerous one, through which modernity thrives on. The institutional arrangement and the political ensemble of imperial democracies is not enough to sustain large-scale investment in secularism. It needs the everyday personal investment of the likes such as me. What did I learn further? That as Taylor's third arc would have it, belief could be an option. At a certain juncture in my life, I chose belief. But following the path that Bhakti dictated proved to be more complicated than just joining with folded hands the assembly at the Banke Bihari or Radharaman temple or chanting the names of the Godhead. The rejection of and revulsion at the ways of the mass of fellow believers were the hook that was pulling me back towards my secular life outside of Vrindavan. Thus, this article is less about the priests who claim that Krishna dances as a peacock at a certain spot, or that good believers must necessarily contribute sums of money to temples, but the curious case of my ready disbelief of such things while embracing the general tenets of the very same faith. This is indeed an account of the difficulties of unlearning secular modernity, as also the nature of an intimate encounter at the emotional level between secularity and religiosity. My adopted religiosity, I learned, was at once alienated because I had come having done some necessary, say, textual research on bhakti, and that the faith readily make itself accessible to me because I had done the requisite homework. It was simultaneously, slide please. Next slide please. It was simultaneous religious life where faith is not an option. I speak here in William Colonley's terms, the conceit of secularism. Thank you.
Thank you.
Devdatta, you can stop sharing.
Okay, cool. Yes. Much. That was, of course, very, very interesting presentation. I'll just straight away open the session to questions, comments, questions, or if there's a problem with the audio, then you can type the questions in the chat box and I can convey to Atreyee. So anybody who would anyone? Questions, comments?
Could I ask?
Yes, please, Vatudha. Yes.
No, thank you for this very interesting take on Taylor in particular. Is that when you say, following Taylor, of course, that the secular modern, in a sense, demands that or claims that religion or God is a matter of individual choice. And I agree with you that this is a relatively recent phenomenon in history. I broadly agree with that part of Taylor's argument, that whether it's 1500 or wherever, that this is a relatively new phenomenon. It's not quite the same as saying that even in pre-modern times, there were heretics and people who did not believe in God. And so, of course, that's true. But this idea in God or in the divine is a matter of an individual choice. I mean, Taylor goes through the whole history of the of Protestantism and bringing the whole thing into a matter of individual conscience and so on. So I mean, I'm not going into that question. But my question is this, that if we also accept that in order to choose, I might have to pay. In other words, the idea of choice is not dissociated from commerce, right? So for instance, if I wanted to listen to music, I accept that I might have to pay in order to buy a ticket for a concert or to buy a CD or whatever it is. Now, why are you suggesting that the secular modern requires that if I chose religion, that somehow it's repulsive if someone asks me to pay for that choice?
Thank you, Parthuda, for that question. So I was referring, when I talked about that Gaudan incident in the temple, I was referring to the subtle pressure, which I found. So if in most art events or music events, people ask for donations. And there's a donation box. You can put in money if you want to. If you may not put in money if you want to. And so this was something like that. It was asking for donations to the temple, and it was 1,100 rupees was a pretty large figure for a number of villagers to pay. I felt I was interested in the fact that they did not think of it as pressure, whereas I felt that I definitely felt in that situation. Well, what is this pressure? Why should I pay? I will pay if I want to, and willingly. So my sense of autonomy was somehow attacked in this kind of conveyance of subtle pressure. Whereas the other believers who were with me in that temple, they didn't seem to think that there was anything wrong with this pressure.
Might that be because, in fact, you felt you were not choosing to subscribe to Godan, Goraksha, whatever that is, whereas the others were perfectly willing to make that choice, and so
Yes.
they felt, yes, sure, I will pay. So in other words, I'm still not sure why you felt that somehow that was contradictory to what secular modernity might demand.
So let me just say, I don't think I'm doing justice to your question here, but very quickly, let me just say that I came away feeling that in some ways my otherwise kind of joyful, romantic sense of Vrindavan was tarnished by a series of experiences that exposed me to this kind of pressurized economic transaction in temples. I went there, maybe it's secular naivety. I went there thinking that there were some ways in which a certain kind of textual, scriptural religion would open up to me. And while that was happening in some measure, I think I'll have to think more about this, but I think what I'm exposing here is a certain naivety that all social institutions, like you point out, art and music and etc., come with their corpuses of pressure, and so does religion. While I give in to the pressure of multinational companies advertising to ask me to buy certain things, I don't see that as pressure, but I see a priest asking for donations in a temple as pressure. I was particularly wanting to put to focus my own sense of disdain at the villagers who didn't feel that there was pressure. And it is this disdain that I want to kind of bring to focus and analyze a little bit more, but I'll have to think more about that. Thank you so much for your intervention.
So Tapotidi and then Ujwala. Tapotidi.
When I was hearing you give this talk, I was reminded of a very recent book discussion I had with another scholar on Vrindavan, which is Sugato Rai, and his book, Climate Change and the Art of Devotion. So just last month, we were part of a book discussion where willy-nilly the same dilemma that you have presented came up. It came up quite centrally when he said that I hated my 2 years of research in Vrindavan. I absolutely hated being there. I could not identify with the current regimes that govern the life, social, cultural life. And yet he was talking about a Vrindavan of a period from the 14th, or rather from the 16th to the 19th century. And that opened up a larger conversation on the nature of both archival and ethnographic research. Now, raising the question that, is it a question just then of abandoning, or as you're saying, leaving behind one's academic secular self and entering worlds of belief, which I think any anthropology, but I feel any historical or sociological work involves both a stepping aside, but also entering worlds that you may or may not be a part of, right? I think that is an essential dilemma that anthropologists in particular, but I think I now feel across social science disciplines, that what kind of empathy and what kind of engagement do we have with that which we are researching? So whether it's in the past or present, and when it's in the past, it's often easier to say study temple architecture, but even to study a sacred landscape of the kind that Mathura Vrindavan is, where every natural element is inscribed with the love and legends of Krishna, right? So on one hand, you can invoke that scripturally through poetry, through songs, through architecture, but somehow when you confront it in the present, it's a different religiosity that may confront. But if I was to push it more generally, I think that, say one is a non-believer. So if the secular becomes a much more burdened term to use because it involves a conscious adoption of a position. So there's a naturalized secularity that we assume for our academic world, and that there could be a much more specific position of secularism, which is normally a political position here. Assuming here you're talking about more naturalized secularity that we as academics inhabit, it's a question then is that you could be working on a mosque site, you could be working on an animist tribal culture, and you would be facing the same problem that, can I learn to believe like they believe, or can I will myself? Here it comes to you in a very stark way of making to pay for a godan or something, right? So I'm saying that it opens up, I think, perhaps a larger and a perennial dilemma that may be outside a secularism versus, choosing to be or not to be religious. Because I think your work on Vrindavan may not have demanded of you any religiosity at all. It would have, as Parthodas said, it may be purely tactical. You pay, you get entry, you get your insider information, and you can then have your own distance. In fact, anthropology requires precisely that you both can enter that world, and yet that double sense of being both outsider and insider. And then you need the distance of your own secular self to be able to write it, right? So I would like to say then that, was this a particular problem of being in Vrindavan and trying to work around what you're calling the devotional sensibilities and landscape, and somewhere wondering how to work with the contemporary nature of that religiosity? Or is it a far larger ethnographic problem? I feel even as historians now, many of us are grappling that, do we choose to work on what we may call religious or devotional sites? That's a particular choice we make, that we want to work on a certain space as against another, and we want to understand that. So when we make the choice, we may not do so as a believer in that faith, But nonetheless, it involves stepping outside certain comfort zones that we have into others. So I would like to pose this to you as a far larger problem, it seems, here than just a question of, secularism versus religiosity. And put a simple thing like, as an art historian, I'm not a practicing artist, but when I try and enter a work of art, I do try and understand the practice that may have gone into it, right? Whether of the past or the present. So in a way, I'm trying to put myself in a position that is not natural to myself, but I'm trying to understand it. So I would like to pose this as a larger problem, dilemma, and challenge that a researcher may face.
In my case, thank you, Tapasiti, for that profound. I was there for Shugaturai's discussion and really enjoyed it. For that profound thought, and let me try to do justice to it. In my case, it's a little bit complicated because I was also trying to practice, not for the sake of research, but simultaneously as a personal journey, I was trying to practice bhakti, and I still am. But that got complicated in various ways I'll put that out very honestly in the beginning, that there was definitely a sense of romance and admiration with which I entered Vrindavan. It had these kind of 400, 500-year-old temples. I met priests and religious leaders who spoke about scriptures and generally Hindu cosmology with great erudition. And I remember talking to Srivatsa Goswami in Vrindavan at some point, and he was saying he was kind of a little bit irritated with the Hindu right building new temples all across Vrindavan, and he was like, this is such an old city, it has so many temples, you don't need to build new temples. So there is a kind of new religiosity that I was facing, a very abrasive one, which was kind of compounded by the rise of the Hindu right. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm interested and ethnographically it poses a huge dilemma, complication, that you're entering a temple as a devotee and an ethnographer simultaneously. I write about that. I try to write about that elsewhere. For the purposes of this paper, I'm only going to tailor and the secularism scholarship simply because I feel I can't think of another word that would explain my sense of discomfort, which was not, I've done other fieldwork also in Howrah for my first project, my first book. When I was doing fieldwork in Howrah also, I came from an American university, and there was a certain discomfort in the beginning. I was a Kolkata girl in Howrah, etc. There was a series of discomfitures that I had to face to adjust myself to the field. This was not so. So I'm used to the ethnographer's initial discomfort of various things, like Susan Harding's work, where she talks about doing ethnography with the Christian right in America. And she writes a great deal about the discomfort that the anthropologist has to endure and how they have to reconcile that with the project of ethnography. Those scholarships notwithstanding, this was a different kind of discomfort, not that so much of a ethnographic researcher, but as someone who was trying to toy with religion from a secular standpoint. And I use the word toy because I can't think of a better word. Someone who's kind of had a adventurous attitude towards religion. Let me try out religion and see what it does to my life. And I came back with a set of conclusions, tentative conclusions, which were contradictory. Vrindavan gave me a lot of joy, a lot of faith. It gave me, outside of providing research material, it gave me a sense of some sense of peace, etc. But it also gave me all of this, where I thought it was unfair that villagers from Bhilwara were asked to pay 1,100 rupees, which is a lot of money, at a temple, and I felt that my sense of secular justice or fairness and also the subtle pressure were being attacked, whereas they didn't feel so at all. So I'm just trying to put at focus what it is for someone who chooses religiosity as opposed to someone who takes religiosity for granted. Many people in Vrindavan who come from various parts of North India, also South India, but mostly North India, have gurus and religious leaders that their families ascribe to, and they think nothing of putting their head to their feet, the feet of the guru. And those are things that I would have some kind of bodily discomfort doing. It's not like the Bengalis doing pranam, but like kind of God kore pranam, as one would put it in Bangla. Things like that, certain kind of bodily practices, certain kind of taken for grantedness that the hierarchies and the power that these leaders exert over me is what it is. It's normal.
Ujjwala, did you have a question?
मैम मतलब ऐसे हमारे को दिमाग में कुछ आया, मुझे पता नहीं, like I don't know if it's very relevant. I'll just say if it's not relevant to you. Like I recently went to the Kalighat temple in Calcutta, and so I was मतलब उन्होंने तो मेरे को डोनेशन और संकल्प और इन सब के नाम पर पैसा देने को बोला गया, बट व्हाट वाज एक्चुअली हैपनिंग वाज आई वाज ब्रेकिंग द लाइन, है ना. तो मतलब तो इस तरीके से मुझे ऐसा लगा डोनेशन और ये सब जो था वो, एंड जो लोग इट वाज नॉट लाइक इट वाज वे टू स्किप एंड सेव टाइम. इट वाज नॉट जस्ट मतलब इन द नेम ऑफ संकल्प और इन ये सब के नाम पे, एंड वो मैं कॉन्स्टेंटली कनेक्ट कर पा रही थी उससे जिस तरीके से डीएम ऑफिस में या फिर सरकारी दफ्तरों में दलाल आपको दर्शन करा देंगे. हाँ. तो क्या आपका जो डिस्कम्फर्ट है वो इस वजह से भी आता है, जैसे कि जो एसपी ऑफिस में हमने देखा था कि लाइक some people did not have the discomfort in paying and meeting the officials, while someone like me would see it as corruption. In the same way, somebody would not have discomfort giving money because they have come so far. भगवान से मिलने के लिए आए हो तो उसमें देना पड़ रहा है, तो क्या गलत है मतलब.
Right. So they've come from very far and they feel that, to get, so everyone was getting darshan. The darshan was not ticketed. But once you got in the temple, there was some subtle pressure to pay this towards Gaudan and a higher amount for Kanyadan. So you're quite spot on. I think that it's the kind of revulsion one feels towards systemic corruption in government offices. And in this case, this was not a government office. This was an institution of religion that I held in very high regard for whatever reason. And then I felt that the same mundane logics of governance that exist in a Sarkari office somewhere, they're getting replicated in the temple in Vrindavan, in Gokul, that I was trying to make a switch from secularism to modern secularism to religiosity, whereas the systemic logics of modern governance were being replicated almost exactly in this sphere, led to some disappointment, which I'm trying to unpack at this moment. But you're spot on when you say that it's exactly like the disappointment when one sees petty corruption in government offices.
Rosin-Kadi, do you?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I'll try and articulate a sort of set of general thoughts that arose. I'm neither an anthropologist nor, particularly working in your area, but because of the general nature of what you speak of, and because what you speak of basically speaks to almost every one of us who have ever visited a Hindu pilgrimage site, I had a sort of two things. So one was the centrality of the self, the centrality of your own self in the presentation that you make. Now, if one were to remove, well, not remove that obviously, but to put that to one side and look instead, if you could tell me at least a little bit more about these, not about the villagers in the sense of content or information, but if you could tell us a little more about what it is exactly you were expecting in terms of the nature of their attachment or the nature of their devotion or whatever pressures you thought they were being subjected to. So yourself is interesting in that it's not exactly the self of what came to mind almost immediately was Arun Kolatkar's Jejuri, where he, describes the goddess Khandoba and famously says, as you know, what is God and what is stone, the dividing line, if it exists, is very thin. So you're consciously distancing yourself from that, secular poetic sort of self, and you so that is what I understand is your position. You are trying to experience devotion, but you find it difficult to leave that secular modern self behind, and the point at which you find it difficult to leave behind is this point of financial extortion and all of that in relation to the villagers. Now this is the point that interests me, because you didn't say very much about what you think the villagers exactly are expecting and what they're experiencing, in the sense that, so why I'm asking you the question is, one is of course societal. In the society that you belong to, it's quite I would take it for granted that you would find it difficult to leave these moral ethical judgments about extortion behind. On the other hand, the society that the villagers have come from would expect them to make this payment, and they're making this payment so that they can go back home to their village and say that they have done what was required of them in their trip to Vrindavan. Number one is just simple societal requirement. I'm leaving religion out of it entirely. That was this thought was also brought on by again, because you brought personal experience into it. My own personal experience of a Bihari man who used to drive our car for a very long time, for about 18 years, and then he died, and then his son came to see us for financial help, and we were giving him money, but he was telling us about how he was expected in his village in Bihar to buy an entire cow for some quarter of ₹1,00,000, and how much it would cost him to, etc. And we were saying, why don't you scale it down? Why do you have to have such a big shraddha? You are not very rich people, and they were just astonished that we should even suggest this to them, because this was the societal requirement. They had to do it. There was no question of, they would take a loan, but they would do it because this is what was required to perform the funeral for their father. So just drawing on that experience, it seems to me that's number one. So the societal requirement. So I'm leaving religion out of it entirely. And the other really was, and now this is going to sound even more eccentric, but I was reminded of Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay's short story Drobomoyir Kashibash, where Drobomoyi is this elderly woman, as you know, who leaves her house and her cow behind in Bengal to go and live in Kashi, to be nearer God. And, widows are expected to spend their last few years of their life in Kashi. And she keeps thinking of her cow. And in the end, and this is the short story, in the end, she comes back to her cow. The cow means more to her than Kashi or the God. So Varanasi and the gods, and the presence of the gods is really nothing in comparison to the pull and the attachment of her cow. So I bring this up again to slightly deflect perhaps and to question what you seem to be interpreting as a sort of as a sort of attachment of the villager to the god, which is being interfered with by this priest demanding fees, to complicate that picture a little bit, and to ask you to explore a little bit what this nature of the attachment that the villager has exactly is. What do you conceive it? I don't think one can understand it, but one can attempt to, at least sort of, I don't know, you must have done ethnographic research. So to tell us a little more about that self rather than the secular modern self that is encountering the village. Sorry, it got a bit long, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Those are a set of really kind of difficult insights to immediately respond to. Let me try. So my attempt in this particular field, I mean, outside of my research concerns priests and leaders and other people who kind of take forward the mantle of bhakti, so to speak. Aside from them, I found that that I was trying to bond with a number of people who affirm faith. Socially, yes, there's a social requirement, like you do shraddho when if someone dies, or marriage ceremonies which cost money, and so on and so forth. But in the pilgrimage site, I felt that there was some expression of doing it before one dies, doing it for ancestors. And the priest also asked me, do you want to do this for your ancestors? And I said, I'll take the lesser denomination of ancestor worship and not the earlier higher denomination, so as to save money. So I think those considerations are also on their mind. I'm just pondering on the fact that this affirmation of fellow feeling between people who are trying to experience the presence of Krishna in the same sacred geography occurred. I guess it's obvious that it did not occur because I came from a different socioeconomic background. But I'm trying to put to question why it didn't occur in a kind of micro drama kind of way, the drama of bonding between someone who's come from Delhi to Vrindavan and the drama of the people who have come from Bhilwara, expecting that they can do the Char Dham after this. The priest says that, oh, you've paid here, so now you can go to the Char Dham, and they want to do the Char Dham before they die or before their parents get too old, and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of sociological reasons. But there persists, I will argue, some amount of faith that we've come here because Krishna exists here. We could have gone to our local temple, but this is better. This is the body of Krishna. And there is that kind of feeling which was common among various people that I spoke to. But sociologically, yes, I agree with you that it is obvious that I wouldn't see eye to eye with them about the priest's authority. But what the takeaway point that I'm trying to work with here is the fact that the approaching the scriptural, the cosmological presence of the deity, of the Godhead, is easier than working through the organized workings of organized kind of nitty-gritties of a religious infrastructure which exists in any sacred geography, be it Benares, be it Hardwar, be it Vrindavan. Those workings are they demand a certain, like Ujwala pointed out, there's a certain system. You have to go through the system, and there's definitely that, and that's the mundane part of it. But there's a definite hierarchical arrangement, which I'm not surprised by. I'm surprised by my difficulty as a believing person to work through it. So much so that.
So the question really is: are the villagers surprised, or are they? So the question is really about them rather than your point. I've understood, but I'm trying to understand what.
It's very likely, because in the presence of the priest, they would not tell me that, we've actually come here to finish the Char Dham so that we feel better about our ancestors, or we've done it so that our villagers feel better about, like we gain prestige in our village. That there may be those kinds of considerations away. Well, in the presence of the priest in the temple complex, they wouldn't say that out loud. They would say कि हम तो यहाँ आए हैं कृष्ण की खोज में, and they would express a certain kind of performative faith, which of which there are obviously sociological underpinnings, just as any kind of so the sociological underpinnings cannot be entirely divorced from their performance of faith. I understand that, but in the temple complex, they would perform a certain kind of faith that I want to take at face value.
Thank you.
So, anyone else? Doesn't look like. So if there are, doesn't look like. So if there are no more questions or comments coming in, then I guess this will be it. Thank you so much, Atreyee. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation, engaging conversation following that. And thank you so much, and
thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks to everyone who were there. Yes, thank you so much.
Bye.
That'll be all.
Thank
Have a
you. Thanks.
nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
So should I end the meeting, Devdatta? Oh no, your host now.
You can, yes, but you have to stop the recording, I think. Is it?
Okay. So I've stopped.
Do I have a stop